Okay, so I'm going to introduce myself again. Carolyn Lancaster, the Children and Families Officer at Randwick City Council, and I want to welcome you to this parenting webinar, Adolescence and Angst with Madeleine Winter. So as the Youth and Families Officer at Randwick Council, we bring you a parenting calendar with free workshops that comes out between January and June of each year and July and December. So keep your eye out for the next one. We'll put it online and it's also available at the library, or we'll be advertising events as they come up that are hosted by Randwick Council, but there are also other events hosted by other agencies that are on the calendar that we don't advertise. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Madeleine. She's a parent educator that has a lot of experience teaching parents and carers and families in the area and beyond. And is there anything else, Madeleine, that you want me to talk about before I hand it over to you? Oh, I just wanted to add that we will be taking questions, and I will read out the questions at the end, but not during the session. So you can pop your questions down at the bottom. There's a little box that says, well, a little tab kind of thing, if you hover over it, called Q&A. You can write down any questions there, and we'll leave time at the end to answer those questions. You can also pop them in towards the end. So we won't be using the chat feature, and you won't be able to, we can't hear you during the recording, so don't worry about that. I'm going to mute myself and hand you over to Madeleine, but I think that's it, isn't it, Madeleine? And we'll go till 11:30 today.
Yep, that sounds pretty good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to Adolescence and Angst. Hopefully unangst, maybe, which is really about staying close to your children as they get older. I'm Madeleine Winter, and I am, let me just get this next. Hang on. This isn't working. Sorry. My slides aren't working, which is no good. Just give me a moment. Sorry. Best laid plans. Okay, that's okay. We're back in business. So welcome in various languages to courtesy of Google Translate. I am disabled in that I only ever learnt one language. So feel free to contact me at any point. Feel free to contact me and let me know if I've got anything wrong there. And I would like to acknowledge country and show my respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. They're the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. And they looked after this country really well for a really long time. And I acknowledge that Indigenous culture survives and thrives, and I get to benefit from what they lost. So before we begin, I think Carolyn's run through this. You're on silent. Carolyn's my assistant. And if you want to ask questions, we'll read them out at the end. There's a Q&A thing there. And I'm always really happy to hear from you. I'd love to hear what's going on for you and whether I can help. So at the end, there will be a little information about how to contact me. And before we start, we parents struggle, and a good part of what we struggle with is that the bottom line is we feel bad about ourselves, and it's important to be reminded that you're a good parent and that you've always done the very, very best that you can. And that as a parent, you face really real struggles and you're not to blame for these. It's to do with the circumstances, you know, that we don't have a lot of control over. And those things that happen in the world land on it in our families, and we have to handle them in the privacy and the intimacy of our most precious relationships. So that's hard. And someday you'll get a little rest. And here's my dear husband on our friend's couch, which pretty much that's what he looks like when he gets there. It's a very delicious couch. So after the webinar, we'll send out recordings and some links to resources. And you're always welcome to contact me. I'm happy to offer a free 20-minute consultation, and there's a little link there, and I'll send you out an email with the link. And as Carolyn has said, you can find quite a lot of resources on the Randwick Council YouTube channel, including a number of past talks that we've done and various other parenting, people with parenting expertise that Randwick has got in, and various others. So you can check out Randwick Council there, and every 6 months there's a calendar that comes out. So my aim today is to give you some tips for easing the way and staying connected through the teen years, which are often tricky, and I think they get a bad rap. I actually think teens get a bad rap. Yeah. I'm hoping to cover what's going on for us and for them, how to build connection. I like to think of it as a bank account, and the connection part is putting credit in that bank account. In general, the direction for us as parents of older children is, I think it's as much where we're at this point of parenting and how our life is going, as it is about what's going on for our teens. So we often need to lighten up by this point of parenting. So I'll talk about that a bit. And I want to talk about how to handle upsets, which, if you think about your relationship bank account, you've built connection, which is the credit, which you basically use up when you're setting limits and handling the upsets that often follow from those limits. We say that upsets are a necessary pathway to cooperation. So they're often quite useful, if a little hard to handle. So this is me. Well, this is actually my husband and my daughter when she was somewhat younger. I've done all sorts of different things. I've been working with Hand in Hand for over 30 years. It made a whole lot more sense when I became a parent. It was pretty fantastic before that, worked with lots of other people's families. And my daughter is now 19, or nearly 19. And becoming a parent, having taught this, Hand in Hand was a way I could connect with other parents, which is really important to being able to sort of get this far, I'd say. And Hand in Hand Parenting, it's an organization based in the US. There are instructors, trained instructors all over the world. And we teach a number of what we call listening tools. Some of them are designed for adults to use with children. And so those are about using ways of playing to connect with our children, and some ways of listening to upsets and handling upsets that build connection. Those are balanced on the other side of what I call the love triangle by tools for building so the connection are balanced by tools for setting things on the right path when someone's heading in an unworkable direction, which you might call limit setting. And then the foundation is the support that we need, a place to offload, to get understanding and perspective. Sometimes perspective is as important as anything else. Something which you're framing as a problem can be reframed, and that gives you more choices about how to respond. But we need a place to offload. It's intensely emotional work. We need a place to develop our understandings of what's going on, and we need a place where we can plan what next needs to happen given all of the things we know about our families, because we're experts on our families. What we get as parents is a lot of advice, and that's not always that useful. And even if it's useful advice, there's work to be done figuring out how's this going to work in my family given everything. Those tools working together contribute to what I call a relationship bank balance. Basically, you have a relationship bank balance with each of the people in your family. You have some joint accounts as well. So the whole family probably has a relationship bank balance. And to some extent, what one person deposits, another person can take out. But what you really want to focus on is your relationship bank balance with each of your children. And in general, connection is the thing that builds credit in the bank account. And when there isn't enough connection, things tend to be more snarly. So there are lots of struggles, and you'll find yourself having to set a lot of limits. On the other side, where there's enough closeness and connection, what you'll get is a generally cooperative tone. The process of building connection and setting limits changes as our children get older. It's not as straightforward now that our kids are older, but it's possible. And the challenge is to keep the balance so that we're not in a place of struggle where our kids are off track, where maybe we're off track, where people are heading in unworkable directions and people are full of feelings. And we want to connect on the one hand, and we can use ways of playing. They get a little trickier as our kids get older, but special time, I'll talk briefly about. That's a very formal way of playing with young people. As kids get older, we generally need to be available for something where we're making the same commitment to them, but it's a much less formal process. You might call it hanging out. On the other hand, we're going to need to set limits, and we're going to need to listen to upsets in order for things to move forward. And somewhere in all of that, what we get is cooperation. We get young people who can use their reason, can think about the problem, and between the you and them, or us and them, what we end up with is workable solutions. I'm not sure there's ever really a right way that's correct for everyone. You'll be needing to make a constant assessment of the shape that you're in, of the shape that your kids are in, what else is going on in the family, what else is going on in everyone's life, how connected you are, and then figure out what you want to do next. I like to talk a little bit about adolescence. This may be much more common knowledge now, but certainly when I was first heading into adolescence, when my daughter was about 10 or 11, into parenting an adolescent, this stuff was very new. And I know that it changed my perspective completely. So it's now well understood that adolescence, in terms of where a human being's brain is at, sort of starts around 12 and extends right through to 24, and some experts put it at later. So a young person's capacity to, basically, my understanding of the difference is that their prefrontal cortex, which is the kind of executive functioning and decision making and judgment, doesn't really fully come online until well into their 20s. And in this process, what our young people are doing is figuring out the whole world for the second time. Their brain is going through a massive reconfiguration. I think the sort of popular wisdom has been that it's hormones, and certainly hormones have something to do with what's going on. But I think the science is now suggesting that what's much more important is a massive reconfiguration of neural pathways. Basically, what happens is that young people just, their brains expand, and basically in adolescence, there's a process of pruning away those parts of your sort of neural network that you don't use, and then strengthening the parts of your brain in your experience that are regularly used. And I will quote a psychiatrist called Dan Siegel, who you may or may not have heard of. He talks about that young people's, at this stage, their brain is a construction site. So bits will come online at strange times. And once everything's online, it all evens up, but it can be a bit jerky in the process. But it's not actually, if things are difficult and unbalanced, it's not a sign that there's a faulty building. There's just a sign that there's a work in progress. And Dan Siegel talks about, he calls it the essence of adolescence. And I really like this framework, both for understanding what's important to and what's going on with young people at this stage, and also for thinking about us. So at this stage, we've been parenting for 10 or 12 or 15 years, and often we're pretty tired. And the other thing that tends to happen is that our children are big enough that we start to get, we get hopeful that we can kind of not be quite so consumed by parenting. And that's true, they're much more independent, but also they actually still need us, and they need us to be around. Not in the same way they did when they were 4, but it's actually important that we're not withdraw too far. Anyway, the essence is consists of emotional spark, social engagement, novelty seeking, and creative exploration, ESSENCE. So emotional spark is the way that at this point in adolescence, the brain is changing and developing, and it's tending to wire in a way that flares into strong feelings fast. That's not always something young people have control over. It's that their wiring is not balanced properly, their brain wiring. The other thing that starts to happen is that our young people are stretching out, and their relationship with their friends and their peers is increasingly important. We can get a little bit hoodwinked there and feel like perhaps they don't need us, but they actually still need us hugely, but in a different way. And they'll prioritize, it'll look like they're often prioritizing their relationship with their friends. And that's a necessary part of getting ready to leave the nest, really. But they'll be coming back to the nest more and, often. And they'll need us to be there when they arrive. The other thing that goes on as a result of the brain changes that are happening are that adolescents will seek novelty. They're likely to be looking for the unfamiliar, the unsafe. They will thrive with uncomfortable. And it's partly to do with a increased reward drive and an increased dopamine response in relation to experience or in response to experience, and a general lack of judgment that you could categorize as a positive bias in their thinking. So, if it's a roulette game, that they're going to be convinced by the 99% chance that it's not going to be your number that comes up. They're not going to balance that against the consequence of what might happen when their number comes up. So the fact that it's very unlikely will be what they'll take into account rather than what the consequence might be if it did turn out to be something that happened to them, if that makes sense. And the other thing that young people are incredibly good at this stage is creative exploration. They're interested in the new, the different, they're imaginative, they're questioning, they're not burdened by, decades of this is how we do things around here. And they will tend to challenge the status quo. Yeah. One of the things about young people at this stage, I think, is that it's particularly hard being an adolescent right now. I think young people get a really bad rap. The ways that they can't comply with how we always do things around here tend to be what gets highlighted rather than their initiatives and their creativity and their exploration. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but we tend to channel feelings we have left over from that period of our life. And often there wasn't good attention for us when we were teens, and that contributes to a general inclination to run adolescents down. In general, young people are not well respected in our culture. Their opinions are not taken into account. There's been an interesting debate. I think New Zealand is proposing to give the vote to 16-year-olds, and I've been having interesting conversations with young people about that. But that's an example of where they're not able to participate in the decision making in a way that they're probably capable of. We often have more expectations of them now that they're bigger. And I may get to talk about this a bit later. We tend to have tense high expectations as opposed to relaxed high expectations. So sometimes we get hoodwinked because they're big, that they ought to be able to do X, Y, and Z. They ought to be able to clean up their room. They ought to be able to do their chores. They ought to be able to get up on time. And some of those expectations are really not that reasonable, given the construction zone that their brain is. That doesn't mean we can't help them to do things, but I think often the idea that because they're adult sized often, we can't expect that they'll be able to organize themselves in the way an adult can. So we have expectations that aren't that realistic. The other thing that happens is that they're still young, and they still need to play. And the further they get through school and into adolescence, the less play there is and the more seriousness there is. And seriousness is really hard on young people. They will tend to want to lighten things up, and being in a world that doesn't allow that is hard on them. And in particular for boys, but as they move into looking more and more like grown-ups, there's just where they're getting less simple affection, and just more sort of isolated. By the time a child is an adolescent, if there are issues which didn't get resolved in early childhood, those will rear their head and get in the way. And the other thing that's tricky for young people at this stage is that they've learned to bottle their feelings. Our society is not one that welcomes big feelings, and we're often not well equipped as parents to handle that. And by the time they get to adolescence, they've learnt pretty firmly, at pain of social death often, that it's not a good idea to show when you're upset. And the problem with that is that feelings tend to snarl up thinking. And if there's a lot of feelings around that are not really getting a place or a way to release, those will get in the way of good thinking. And the other thing I think we need to understand is that our young people are facing a world that's really, I think, quite profoundly different from the one I faced when I was young, and that many of us faced when we were younger. And the state of the world, in particular, I think the reality of climate change and the implications of that's a really hard future to be looking towards, and that's drags them down. Then for us, we tend to be a little more isolated in our parenting by this stage. If our kids have got struggles, we're very careful about talking about them out of respect for our children and not wanting to sort of spread a reputation around. We don't head off to the park to play and meet other parents. We're not going to play groups like we might have been able to with other parents and their kids. It's much more isolated, and we're not connecting with other parents in the same way. And we're often, you know, as I said, we've come out of early parenting. It's such a relief to have more independent human beings around you, and we can often get pretty busy with whatever the next stage of our own life is, and that doesn't necessarily leave a lot of room for getting support around our parenting. We also tend to be a bit tireder. As I said, we're getting busy by this stage if we haven't already been flat chat. And we tend, as I said earlier, to get hoodwinked because they're big, we think they're able, and our expectations are sometimes not that reasonable. We were also young once, and as I said before, we're at every stage of parenting, we're basically channeling, and sometimes we're aware of this and a lot of the time we're not. We're channeling what it was like for us. So we will tend to respond in the way that people responded to us when we were this age, or we will confuse our child's struggles with our own. It will look to us like they have the same struggle we had. And I like to say to parents, by definition, they haven't got the same struggle we had. They have you. And most of us didn't have anyone who really could, perhaps I should speak for myself, but there was no one who was really thinking about me. And it was pretty tough going. And I think that's often the experience for adolescents and our experience of adolescence. We also, all parents are vulnerable to, if you give me someone and they're worrying, good chance they're a parent. So we worry, we catastrophize, we worry that the behavior we're seeing now is our son turning into a monster, or, it's going to be irreparable, and the worst outcome is what we start to worry about. And we also tend to focus on the negative. We tend to focus on what they're not doing rather than noticing what they are doing. And if our relationship with our kids has some history, and you've come out of early parenting with struggles, as I said, that haven't really resolved, add adolescent hormones to that, and it gets really, and adolescent brain changes to that, and it gets really hard, and they're big. And so setting limits in a way we might have been able to get away with when we really did have control over everything gets a lot harder. So it's all tricky. One of the things I think we always, as parents, need to be thinking about our own, what shape we're in. But I think it's particularly important at this stage. Our young people are looking at us as in general, I have to counsel parents out of worrying about whether or not your child is getting the right idea, or whether you're modeling the right kinds of things to your child. I think that parenting is much more a project of helping someone be emotionally intact and then they can think well, than teaching them a whole lot of stuff. Human beings are pretty smart. Whatever needs to be learned will be learned if there aren't barriers in the way. But one of the things I think is important at this stage is that our young people are looking at us, living good lives. we need to pay attention to our essence, our emotional spark, our sense of adventure, our social connections, our creative exploration. So that's a whole subject in itself, really. But thinking about that and making space for that is important. In fact, whatever it looks like, our young people really want the best for us. There's a lovely, it's getting a little old now, but there's a lovely piece of work by a researcher called Ellen Galinsky, and she interviewed a whole lot of young people about their lives and what they wanted and how they felt about things. And she says this: even more than the desire to spend more time with us, young people want their parents to be less stressed and less tired. They really want the best for us, and they want us to be in the shape where we can be with them without being preoccupied with a whole bunch of other stuff. So we really need to ask ourselves, have we lost our sparkle? And Dan Siegel, again, in the book, I actually don't, I find the book Brain, I find a lot of books very wordy. And the book Brainstorm is very wordy. When at the end of this webinar email address, I will send you some resources, and there's a couple of videos of Dan Siegel's in there that I think are as good a summary of what he has to say as reading the book. But basically, he observes that what adolescents have going for them, that is both a challenge and a gift, is actually what adults need in order to maintain vitality in their lives. So part of what sometimes is hard on us about being around young people is that we've lost our sparkle. And we need to take the space to notice where we feel connected, where we feel open, what makes us happy, what makes us pleased and relaxed. And that is going to reassure our adolescent children in a very profound way. In general, what we found in hand is that we really need to focus first up on connection. That actually doesn't mean we let our kids do whatever they want. That's not useful. But in general, human beings function better when they feel connected, and they can use their what I call their thinking brain as opposed to their feeling brain when they feel connected. And a sense of connection, the research is increasingly clear that the thing that keeps people in good shape well into their old age is their sense of social connection. It's incredibly important for human beings. And we respond to each other. There was this lovely little piece of research, which is not about teens, but someone did some study of the movement patterns of babies in utero, and they move differently, or twins they move differently in relation to each other than they do in contact with the womb. So they're oriented towards each other in a way that they're not oriented towards their home. That's how we are. We're looking for other people to connect with. The challenge for us as teens, as parents of teens, is that our role is changing. And I find this a useful analogy. When our kids are little, we're the sun around which they orbit. When we rock up and say, do you want to play? Many little ones just couldn't think of anything better and are delighted if we're prepared to. There's ways of playing that work better and it's sort of more efficient for building connection than others, but basically they're very oriented to us. We're shifting, however, from being the sun around which their universe orbits to being the heater in the room, which is actually no less important, but they will notice when you aren't there, as opposed to you really can't get away a lot of the time with sticking yourself right in front of them and beaming the hot sun of your love upon them. You really need to be warming the air up around them. And it's a lower key role, but it's incredibly important. It's going to involve making sure you have the space in your life to hang out, to be there when they want you, not when you need them to do, not always when you need them to do something. You'll need to make yourself available, hanging out in the same space, ready to put things down when they initiate something, but without agendas, with no particular place you have to be. Low intensity family time is always good, but it's particularly important once you've got a household with adolescents in it. And you're really going to need to work hard to stop, we would call it nagging, basically. We keep asking people to do the same thing, even though it's clear that that request isn't working. And if that request isn't working with your teen or your early adolescent, then you need to stop it and figure out something different. So you need to eliminate the negative in the relationship. Part of what's happening for them is that I like to think about the brain and hormonal shift that's going on. It's intensely consuming. So kids have, at this stage, have less sort of connection credit as a base level. They're really busy internally. I think about it a bit like what it felt to me like being pregnant, that the business of growing a baby was intensely busy internally and took up a huge amount of attention of my sort of being. That's what being an adolescent is like. So they don't have the same sort of slack that they might have had when they were younger. And we need to be careful about how many withdrawals we're taking out of the bank account, because there's less credit in it at this particular point. So noticing the places where we are, where things are not going well in our interactions with them, and really figuring out whether we need to continue doing that, and really looking for the places where we can notice that they're doing well. The other byword, my big byword for hanging out with and parenting adolescents, is that if your tone is not cheerful, you probably need to go away and do some work on yourself. We need to set limits, but as soon as we get angry, grievancing, irritated, it's really hard not to do that. And we need places where we can go, where we can talk about how sick of it we are. But basically, unless our tone is cheerful, it's probably not going to work. So we need to take a cheerful attitude towards limit setting, which often means, you know, you're going to have to remind them a lot often, because their brains really aren't fully working. That's fine. That's what you have to do at this point. But it needs to be cheerful rather than resentful. Resentful assumes that they can do it on their own. And sometimes they can, but not always. And they often need help from us as they figure out the world and figure out being independent in it. So here's a few quotes from Ellen Galinsky again about what our children want. They want the best for us. They really want our lives to be good, and they want the best of us. Even when it looks like they don't want us there, we're incredibly important. Kids said things to Ellen like, well, you know, when we're teens, we're so busy pushing our parents away that when we want them, it's hard to ask. And I'm more comfortable if my parent just notices that there's something wrong and says it, because I find it hard to break that barrier. But I really do want them. They really want us. However, how they communicate that requires decoding. I really love foul language comics. So this is the tween translator, grunt, which means thank you as always for your trouble. So we teach a listening tool, which is about It's called special time. And generally with younger kids, we really emphasize that it's worth doing it very formally, announcing it, timing it. The reasons for that are that it has a young person knowing exactly how long they've got you and exactly what your commitment is. If you were trying to tell someone something important, but they were diving off to answer their phone all the time, you wouldn't feel emotionally safe to tell them what you need to tell them. And what we want to build with our young people is a sense of emotional safety where they can show us where they have struggles and we can work out together how to help. Once children get to be teenagers, that if you can still often get away with formal special time in early adolescence, but as they move into the teenage years, it's not as comfortable for them when we bowl up to them and offer our, as you say, as you know, as I said, that like the burning light of our sun, up, you know, shine that upon them. It needs to be a little more low key. But it's still really important. And in our heads, our commitment needs to be the same. So special time fundamentally is a one-on-one adult to child time spent doing what the child really wants to do. And you want to let them lead the way and take the initiative. And you're bringing your willingness and your delight and your interest for the time that you're with them in doing special time. You want to put your phone. I remember I first started doing special time. I remember when mobile phones first came in, and I really noticed how much more distractible I was. I literally have to have my phone in the boot of the car or somewhere where I can't get it because I just can't really it's just incredibly distracting. When we're doing this hanging out time with our young people, we really need it to be off limits that we bring up sore subjects. We really want to try and not take over, and we don't want to ask prying questions or indicate judgment or refer to difficulties in our lives or in our young people's lives. It's really a time where you're still and waiting for what they want to do and being interested in what they want to do. The connection that builds with this kind of time spent with our young people creates the emotional safety that means at the right time we can bring up the difficult subjects. But if we don't have this place where they know we're on their side and they borrow from this when we have to manage limit setting and other things that are harder in our relationship. And in general, it's going to be important. So kind of no amount of that kind of special time will balance things if we're really negative in our interactions in general with our older children. So we really need to, I've already said this really, eliminate the negative, emphasize the positive, understand that if they could, they would, and they may need support to do what needs to be done, and maintain a cheerful tone. We really want to give up negative comments that reflect our disappointment in them about their appearance, their clothing, their friends, their TV, their food choices, or electronic habits. Screens are a whole huge topic in themselves. My general approach is, yes, they're definitely addictive, and we need to think through what we do about that. But we're all often quite addicted too, and we're not necessarily modeling, you know, a good use of screens ourselves. But the thing I really think we need to be very careful about around screens is that it is at the center of their social life in a way that those of us who didn't grow up with the kind of electronic and digital communication that's possible now, I think we struggle to understand how young people are using that and how incredibly important it is to them and to maintaining their sense of connection with each other. So that's a whole topic in itself, which we might do sometime, but yeah. So we want to just hold off on giving advice and unsolicited opinions. We want to ask interested questions, but don't pry, and don't offload at your teen, and you really need to work hard at not taking it personally. They're not going to look after you anymore. Little ones may be more inclined to look after you. Teens have worn out on that and don't have the internal reserves for it. You need to focus on what they're doing well, what makes them feel happy and alive, on building in plenty of laughter and playfulness. This is really important. We need to focus, and I often will give parents of teens an assignment for a couple of weeks to take notes. Just notice when they invite you in. When do they invite you in? What are the circumstances under which they do that? These can be tiny little bids for attention. I notice that I don't get to do very much hanging out with my 19-year-old. She's busy now, but when she was still at school, I hung on pretty hard to the business of driving her to and from school, and had the luxury of organizing my day around helping that to happen. And part of why I did that is that driving really works with teens. And I've heard stories of people who start off on a drive and end up sort of taking the long way home, because there's something about being in that space together in the car, but your attention is not fully on them. They really often can't handle the full glare of our attention. I think that part of that is about the way that by the time you're a teenager, you've learned to keep everything under wraps. And when we put our full attention on our young people, a lot of those feelings surface, and that's not, so they're used to keeping it under wraps. And so it's a bit frightening when we come bowling up to them. Yeah. So we need to notice when they invite us in. So the drive to and from school, what I noticed was my daughter would put stuff on, would share her music with me, and we would get to talk about that. And I don't have to like it, like some of it I don't like so much, but I'm interested and she's showing me stuff. So, you know, wherever they invite you in, if they have something they want to show you or tell you or do with you, at this stage, you really want to do your best to put everything else down and give them your full attention at that point. It's part of the shift in power and in your relationship that happens as they get older, that they need to negotiate when and the terms on which you're going to hang out together. And little ones don't need to do that, but older kids do. And the other thing is that it's really important not to take yourself too seriously. One of the hardest things on young people is how seriously adults take themselves. And it's enormously, even if they're rolling their eyes, it's such a big relief for us to cheerfully accept that we don't know everything, or, you know, cheerfully send ourselves up when we're getting a bit serious, cheerfully make mistakes, or be cheerful about the mistakes that we make and be honest about the mistakes we make. Generally, the byword is cheerful, and it takes us a long way. And we need to understand that if our teens could, they would. That feelings get in the way of thinking, and that when we set warm limits, they can be firm, but they need not to be mean. And we can hold out expectations for our young people. And what that does is it brings feelings to the surface. So often something will be getting in their way of being able to take a particular direction. We can hold out that it's possible, and then they'll get to complain and have big feelings about it. That's actually, those feelings are the feelings that are getting in the way of them being able to do what they need to do. And our job is to listen to those feelings. We also need to understand that when we set limits, it uses connection credit. And at this stage, as I said, the connection credit is lower, and therefore we need to confine our limit setting to those limits which are absolutely necessary. And certainly the first criteria for that would be, is there a safety issue here? That's a really important place for them to know that you will step in. It's much less straightforward where you set limits and where you don't. And one of the things about limit setting at this point in parenting is, to be honest, it's about figuring out what's workable. It doesn't make sense to keep trying to set a limit that you can't hold, that it's not actually practical for you to enforce. And there'll need to be some thinking about a different way around the problem if you can't hold that limit. If it's a really important limit and you can't hold it, some thinking needs to happen. But setting limits that you can't hold, if you think those limits are important, that's going to be problematic. So an example would be, you know, if there's a big screen addiction in your household and someone has access to their phone, it's not realistic to set a limit or hold out an expectation that they're not going to sit until 2 a.m. on their phone. You probably need to provide some kind of firmer limit, which involves not having access to their phone, if you can. If that's not possible, then you really have to make a judgment. Is this worth it? Because it's really going to chew up credit. Is it, if I can't actually hold this limit, is it really important? I spent quite a lot of time just thinking through that stuff with parents of teens. So limits use credit, and one of the things that's often lacking in when we hold out expectations, or expectations are a kind of limit, is that we don't offer enough support. Young people need a lot of scaffolding and support towards what it is that we want them to do. And it's the support piece that we often don't figure out that well. Expectations and support are including support with the feelings that come up when they're pushing up against that expectation or trying to head in that direction. That's where progress happens. And one of the things about expectations is that they need to be relaxed, high expectations. Young people need us to want the best for them. But if we're tense about that, and if we get mean and punishing, that's really not going to help them. So around limit setting, we want to lighten up. We need to stop sweating the small stuff. We need to really pick our battles. I want you to be safe, happy, and well. Those are the principles for where it is we want to use up credit setting limits. We really need to give up nagging. It's this funny thing we do where we keep on asking in the same way, the same thing, even though it's not achieving anything. All it does, it doesn't get the thing done, and it doesn't, and it uses up the connection credit in our relationship with our teens. It's really better to go and clean their room, although that's a whole other topic as well. Like there's issues around their space and their privacy, but you know, you might be better to go wash the car yourself, or wash the car with them as a way of doing something together and engaging them in a job that needs to be done, than nagging them to do it. You really want to give up supervising daily tasks, sort of planning making some sort of process where you get out in the open what all the jobs are that are connected with keeping a household going. And ideally, your teen can engage with bits of that they want to do. But once they've said that, your job is not to nag them about it, but to offer cheerful reminders and scaffolding and support if that's what they need. And, you know, even we can feel so justified in getting preoccupied with some of the smaller things, partly because we're tired, we're sick of all the work that's involved in keeping a household going, but that's our issue, not theirs. We need to somehow bring them along. The other thing that really doesn't work well is rewards and punishments. And again, that's a whole topic in itself. But basically, by and large, the problem with getting things done or heading in a workable direction is that someone is carrying some big feelings that are getting in the way. And rewards or punishments, they're sort of different ends of the same stick, really. And what they do is assume that the problem is about remembering and about understanding. You've agreed that this is the goal. You'll remember that you'll get a reward if you achieve the goal. And the problem is that when someone bumps into a big lot of feelings that are getting in the way of heading in the direction they've agreed they should head in, they're probably not going to remember or care about the reward that you're offering, and possibly about the punishment. Once they're in that place where they're not thinking, and teens are particularly vulnerable to not thinking well because they're inclined to head towards risk and danger and social experiments. Once they're in that place, they're not going to remember. They're not going to be either interested or remember what you've offered as a reward or as a punishment. It's not a motivating thing, and it ultimately just uses up connection credit in my experience. You want to try figuring out something different. And as I've said, it's largely emotional tension that gets in the way of workable behaviors. And when anybody feels disconnected, they're in their feeling brain, not in their thinking brain. And we often try to appeal to their thinking brain, so by offering a whole bunch of reasons and justifications. And in general, you probably need to use more background to your limit setting with older young people than with little ones. But in general, say around setting a limit, it's really, once you're saying more than 5 words, no, I'm not going to let you, that's even more than 5 words. You can't have the car keys, you know. But once you're saying more than 5 words, you're justifying rather than setting a limit against which they may push. But in the end, there's going to be some feelings that may help things get clearer. And at least they, haven't got in the car. So when you run into trouble, it's because there are stressful experiences which have accumulated and created emotional tension, and that drives feelings off track. That they migrate and snowball and drives behavior off track. And combined with the fact that it's hard being young, you get told what to do a whole lot, there's not nearly enough room to take initiative. And the fact that we often, things have landed hard, but we aren't always aware of what those are. And little things can trip up big feelings. So something where you haven't let them do something they want to do may pull up, years worth of resentment on their part about how they weren't allowed to do what they wanted to do. So some little thing can trip up some big feelings, and that's okay. It gets trickier as our kids are older when they have big feelings. It's a little trickier than when they're 3.5. But in general, it's the same thing. And we grown-ups have big feelings about little things. We're doing it all the time, so they're no different. And the reality is that if we're constantly shutting down that process of showing your feelings, it doesn't actually make them go away. It just sends them underground. So we need to expect upsets. When we set limits where we can tell our young ones are not heading in a workable direction, they're going to be upset. It's necessary. They need to offload emotional tension. It is the pathway to cooperation. And when that upset comes out mean and nasty in our direction, I find it useful to think about it as a badge of honor. It's that you're safe enough for them to land their arrows in the pillow of your heart, rather than throwing their arrows somewhere where it's not going to be safe for the arrows to land. And young people will they need to fight their way towards cooperation. They're needing to fight against big feelings that have come up and accumulated. And it's going to be a bit snarly, and it's not a sign that things are wrong, because it is. And you're going to need some support. You need a place where you can talk about how things are for you. So just, a little primer on listening to feelings. Basically, tears release stress and grief. Tantrums release frustration. That's most clear with really little kids. But do you know what? Grown-ups have tantrums too. We're just bigger, and often those tantrums are a bit more destructive, and that needs to be handled. But basically, we need to release our frustration as well. Laughter is incredibly powerful in its capacity to heal fears. And in particular, as children are heading towards later childhood, there's a lot of unfairness they've had to suffer, and they'll need to tell us about it. It's called righteous indignation. It's not defiance, but it's the way that story about all the things that were not fair seems to come out on a regular basis. That's important. It's part of them offloading this big source of tension about not getting to have the freedom to do things the way they want to do them. And if young people get to use those emotional release processes, they'll be thinking much more clearly. And the listening tool that we teach for meeting our children in that place is called stay listening. So when your tween or teen is upset, they're not able to think about how to keep things safe. You're the safety manager. You need to stay as close as you can and not take things personally. So they'll say really rotten things when they're in the middle of that upset. Generally, they don't mean them. If they're saying rotten things all the time, then there's probably an off-track behavior there that you need to set a limit around. But when they're in the middle of an upset, they're going to say things that it's important you not take personally. And we want to not be always jumping in to fix everything. So as they get bigger, the upset gets bigger. So, more than when they were little, there'll be loud noises, strong words, a fair bit of stomping around and slamming doors. And we just need to keep things safe. And stopping the crying or stopping that upset doesn't stop the feeling. I haven't got it here, I don't think, but basically, I think grumpiness is part of the course, that we need to not take grumpiness personally, that grumpiness is about I think a lot of it is about when they've gotten close enough to us that it's bringing some feelings up that they've had tightly under wraps. So yeah, it's just useful to understand that it's not personal. They may point it at you, but that's your badge of honor, that you're safe enough for them to point it at, you know. And you can say, I don't want you to talk to me like that, but your tone needs to be warm. And yeah. So we're going to need a place where we can download about how hard it is and where we know that it's confidential. I think the issue of confidentiality, we're generally more keenly aware of how important that is. But basically, we need a place where we can talk about what it was like for us when we were adolescents. We can sometimes remember specific incidents that were difficult, but a lot of it is just about we breathed it in and we tend to breathe it out. And it just comes out of us and we end up sometimes, God, I'm sounding like my father. That's not useful to them. It's useful for you to get to talk about, I think actually at any point of parenting, what was it like for me when I was this age? We also just need somewhere to blow off steam, and that helps us to gain perspective. And whoever is listening to us, we teach a process called a listening partnership, but it's useful if the agreement is that this person isn't going to take anything that you say and use it in the wide world. You need a place where you can safely blow off and say anything you need to say, and then it's done and it'll never be mentioned again. So you can find someone you can share a listening relationship with. You may have a friend you can do that with. Sometimes it's a little hard to keep it confidential, but also you're really welcome to be in touch with me. I love, as I say, to hear how these talks land, what you have questions with, what you would like help with. Companies sometimes on the journey of just figuring out what the next step is. So feel free to book a short free consult and we can figure out how we might work together. And that's the end of my little talk. I like to acknowledge all of the people who have so generously put their photographs out into the world and under terms that mean I can use them. So in the slides that you'll be able to download from my website, you'll find this page. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding me to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we live and work, which I did not include in the beginning of the recording, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I think you did that, but I would also like to acknowledge them and anyone who's present here. We've got some questions here that I'm going to read out, and please feel free. We've only got 3 questions. Oh, someone said they don't have audio. I guess it
looks like she solved the problem.
Okay. I'm not going to read the name of the question, who asked the question, just for privacy, unless everyone can see. Daily tasks versus daily routines. Is there a way of setting those without nagging? The only question so far.
Okay. I think that it's one of the big snarls in our relationship with our young people. It's now a closed group, that it's not open for comments anymore, although I think it's still worth taking a look at. It's still up on Facebook, but hand in hand, I used to moderate for many years a group for parents of teens on Facebook for hand-in-hand parenting, and the issue of tasks and chores was a constant one. I think what we have to decide is that if we've ended up nagging, we're better off doing the job ourselves than nagging at our kids. We have to figure out, because it just really chews up credit in our relationship at a time when it's low anyway. And so we need to not nag. I I'm experimenting with an approach which a woman called Eve Fiesel, I think her name is. It's called Fair Play. It's a book about the work of keeping a household going and how to distribute that work. And I think there's something to be said for a process where all of the work that's involved in keeping a household going, because they're at a point, particularly in their mid to later teens, where, you know, they can do some of that, but a lot of it isn't evident to them. Like, we need to actually bring it out into the open and have a family meeting where it's identified and where they may be able to choose something that they want to do. I think the mistake that happens if we can get to that point is that we expect that they will be able either to remember or to continue to want to do it, or to do it the way we want them to do it is the other problem. So I think that's where cheerful reminders are what we need to do. We are the cheerful reminder. And if our cheerful reminder results in grumpiness and bad temper, that's effectively what's happened there. Is you've set a limit. The limit in this case looks like, honey, you know, it's time to take the trash out. I've been doing too much American stuff. It's time to take the rubbish out. And being cheerful about that, maybe even getting playful around it, even if they roll their eyes. If they're getting grumpy, it's that your warmth has brought the feelings up that are getting in the way of doing what it is they've decided they're going to do. But I think more than anything else at this stage, if what we're asking of them isn't working, the first step is to stop. Unless it's a safety issue or it's about their health or wellness, I think we have to stop asking them to do it if we can't figure out some other way of moving things forward with them. They'll generally come to it at some point. I mean, in the end, they're going to live on their own without us, and they'll have to figure stuff out. But yeah, I don't think it's worth grinding our relationship down if we can't figure out some way. If they're just not doing what they've said they're going to do, I mean, what are you going to do? Keep nagging and dragging, like using up emotional credit. So I hope that's useful. You'll find a link in the resources that I send to an article I've written about nagging and why it doesn't work. But it's, you know, you're not the only parent of a teen who's struggling with this. So, yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. I was a nagging mom of teenagers.
Well, okay.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. That reminds me of something else to say, though, Caroline, which is that we've always done our best when everything's taken into account. And sometimes when we hear something about how it could have been done differently, we lose ourselves in feeling, it's almost inevitable, like it's our big Achilles heel as parents, but we lose ourselves in feeling bad about it. And that doesn't really move anything forward. So we need somewhere where we can go and say, I did a terrible job. That's not our children. And then we need to just do something different. But yes. Yeah.
Well, look, they're all
they still love you. They're talking to you. And I mean, that's the other thing to say.
But they remember.
But this is a long-term project.
Oh, yeah.
This is a long-term project. What you're working towards.
Oh, no, they're in their 30s.
Yeah, that's right. Is 24-year-olds, 30-year-olds who want to talk to you.
They don't live with me anymore, so there's no more nagging, but I have stopped giving all that stuff. So I did learn the hard way. Anyway, we've got a question here. One of the words is a comment. Sometimes to stay listening at this age, this is what I think this word means. Sometimes to stay listening at this age just seems like I'm getting beaten up, helping him, my son, but at the expense of my own self-esteem. So yeah, I can imagine what you're listening to there.
Yeah.
Leave that to you, Madeleine.
I think, yes. And we need to keep, so physically beaten up is one issue, and we really need to keep things safe. So if things are explosive, you're going to want to put a door between you and them. Or I think we have to, we're no use to them if we've landed on the end of a punch, basically. It's tricky, and it's a kind of constant dance about how long you keep pushing around something and how much you just let them go because you can't handle what they bring up when you get close with the limit. I think those things are you know, I really think we need to think about those issues and those places in our relationship with our teenagers in company together about how to navigate it. We need a place to work on how we feel about how they are. It's not going to work if your sense of being worthy is being ground down. But the bottom line is, at this point, they don't have the resource, or they rarely have the resource, to look after us. And we really need to do that, looking after, take care of our own business. So it sounds to me like it doesn't sound easy, and thinking about how to manage it when he's upset is something it probably would be good to talk about with someone else. We're left on our own thinking about this stuff a lot. Sometimes our partners, if we have a partner, can be helpful, but it's very isolating. So thinking about how to get it so that you can handle it better, and how it's landing on you, and how to deal with the fear you end up with. It's very difficult. We feel bad as parents a lot. So we need a place where we can take that, I think. It's very hard without somewhere to sort of have a bit of a sob about it, or a complaint, or a rage, to keep hold of how incredibly important we are to them, how much of a difference we make, how being prepared to at least have a go at listening to them be dissatisfied and upset with us, how incredibly powerful that is, because most of us didn't have anyone who listened at all. It got shut down, or we got rejected very quickly when we showed our struggle. But it sounds like you're in a tricky spot there, and it'd be good to get some help with navigating it, is what I'd say. I don't think it's not always straightforward, and it's not as simple as me time. I really can't stand all that self-care stuff, but it's like we do need, it's more complex than that, I think.
Yeah, that's really a good point. And I will say the game changer for my kids was with the listening and the empathy, and not running to defense. And I know there can be a lot of anger, and just acknowledging that that's actually how they feel. But it doesn't mean I need to take it on. I think that was the game changer for me. And getting resource, like you suggesting, Madeleine, getting support, getting resourced to listen, because that can be very difficult. Anyway, we have one more question. The person who you just responded to said, I'll try to up the listening partner time. Also wondering, if we don't comment on certain things, do we let manners go? I guess let's answer the other question, or do you want to just tag that on because it was part of the same response? In other words, always commenting, do we also refrain from commenting on manners? But we do have another question to respond to, and I know we only have 10 minutes left, so.
I think manners is tricky. I think you have to assume if they're not able to behave in a way that's workable, which is to, if someone's behaving in a way that's going to make people socially tense, then it's not workable. And manners are often about what's socially acceptable or not. So you have to assume there's some emotional block getting in the way of your child being able to tell what's appropriate and what's not. They probably I think being able to remember what's appropriate and what's not, and being able to make a good judgment about where it's worth hanging things out in public and where it's not. So in that case, I think it's not straightforward. It's like, what is it that's getting in the way here, and being able to figure that out and tackle that. The other thing I'd say about manners is children poke at manners and they poke at manners because, in fact, manners are often about areas of social tension, that if you don't behave in that certain kind of way, it generates enormous social tension, and young people really don't like that kind of tension. So they'll tend to do stuff that pokes at us, really. And if we cannot get offended by that and figure out a way to make it funny or to send ourselves up, it can give them everyone a chance to laugh, and that releases the tension and then leaves a bit more room for being able to figure out what's going to work here and what's not. But we feel very entitled to what we think is the correct way to behave, which is what manners is. And I think once our children are adolescents, we're beginning to really need to look carefully at those places where we feel so clear that we're right. That doesn't mean that it makes sense for them to poke at it, like, being rude to the principal of the school probably isn't going to be workable, even if there's good cause for it. So, you want to be helping your children get to the point where they can make good judgments around that. I think it's a sign that you need to look, am I being tense here in a way that probably isn't useful? Or what is my child trying to tell me? And how can I tackle that, perhaps in a different context, but effectively working to drain the feelings that are getting in the way.
Yeah, so looking for the underlying cause.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to move you along because we do have two more questions. So this is a longer one, but it might be a shorter answer.
Okay.
So Madeleine, you mentioned conversations while driving to and from school.
Yeah.
And I've often heard similar advice, routines, which I appreciate. This particular attendee cannot do it for personal reasons. The driving in the car, the kids walk themselves to school, and there's limited car commuting.
Yeah.
What are other routine experiences? Because they have a teen and a baby, possibly. So it's hard to be in and out the car and all that, whatever, the sun and the heater. So and I don't know if this is connected to the same question, how to get a smooth transition between those two parenting roles, and are there other routine experiences that can have these opportunities for intimate but low pressure conversations?
Yeah. I think they're two different people, I think.
Okay.
Two different questions.
They were asked the same question.
If we're not driving in cars, what can we do? Really
yeah, because I'm thinking getting in and out of the car to start, but I guess you're right, it's two different. But then we've got a third question. So, Madeleine, I'm going to ask you to be quick with the answers.
Okay. People can always get in touch with me, by the way, if you've got more questions.
I think people would like the answers too, if they can.
Yeah.
I know you're not into short.
I know I'm a bit
people the full answer. I get why, but yes.
Okay. So, cars, there's just something interesting about cars because there's something about the confined space, but your attention isn't fully on them. But if you're not doing that, which there are good reasons not to do, can you walk with them to school if what they're doing is walking? Or are there other points in your routine? Can you can you be in the same room as them, you know, without your full attention on them? Can you be reading something or looking at your phone in the same room as them when they're doing their homework? Or dinner, I think family meal times are also often a time where the attention isn't directly on them, but on the business of being together, having a meal, and interesting conversations can come up. The main thing is about being really attentive to where they invite you in and they initiate some kind of interaction. And we often, they're often quite small bids for our attention. So noticing those and being prepared to divert yourself from what it was you were planning to do, pay attention then. And any other place where you can both be on the same track or heading in the same direction, but without the attention being directly on you and them, is what I'd say in answer to that. You don't need it to be in a car, but it's probably not going to work so well on a train. It's not intimate enough. So it's about figuring out something where you're sharing a space, but you're waiting for them to tell you something. Yeah.
Great. So the other question was just having a teen and a baby, but we did have another one about night owls that like to talk late, and that's the last question. So
yeah,
you're tired.
Okay. All right. I'll be really brief. I'll be really brief. Teen and baby is hard. I think that's what I'd say.
And you can contact Madeleine.
Yeah, you can contact. Teen and baby is hard. They're you're right. You're the sun on the moon to the baby, and you're something else to the teen. I think the important thing is to keep, the baby will grab your attention. The important thing is to be noticing where your teen invites you in and seeing if you can't figure out at least some of those times where baby isn't around, so that you can move in alongside your older child and pay attention to what's of interest to them. So making sure that you get that time in with the older child, because the little one will be so, you know, it's so demanding having smaller children. But I think it is really difficult. And then the night owl, that's a whole other topic. I would seriously recommend looking up a guy called Matthew Walker. He's actually got a podcast, but he's a sleep researcher, and he's got really interesting things to say about the biological, the shift that happens. The short version is their biology shifts in general so that they will be up late and sleeping late. And a world that ticks to the beat of getting up at 6 a.m. and being at work by 9 a.m. Is really, really hard on their biology. It resolves in sort of the mid-20s, but it's not lack of willpower, it's a biological process. And that nighttime time, where that is a time when they will often invite us in to come and have a bit of a chat with them, and a lot of things, they can tell us a lot while we're lying around, you know, at that last end bit of the day. If that, I don't do well past about 8 p.m. So it's not a spot I'm particularly good at. I think sometimes it's worth just dragging yourself up that extra hour later to catch that little space. You're right to observe. It's an incredibly common and important sort of space where there's nothing else to do. I don't know. It just, that time is really precious. Needs to get in there sometimes. I think it's worth it. And I do understand if it's hard to do, because there's often other jobs that need to be done, or you may be like me, really not good by 10 p.m. So yeah, but there's a reason their biology is on a different timetable. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We've got rooming. Hold on. Oh yeah, just a thank you from rooming. But she also I don't know if we have time. How can we encourage she appreciates you emphasize the importance of acknowledging their emotions and allow them to release their feelings. How can I encourage them to move on rather than sitting with their big feelings too long? How to deliver a message that is encouraging rather than educating.
I'd say two things about that. One is I think it's tricky, and it's good to be figuring that out with someone else's, whether it's your partner, or that's a lot of what I end up doing, is trying to navigate that kind of complex thing. But one is, we will get sick of listening to their feelings way before they're done telling us. And it's because we didn't get to talk about ours. We've got a big pile of stuff that sits there and flares, or gets irritated or feels like they're taking too long. So that's one thing to say. However, people do get bogged down in how they're feeling. And I think having routines, sometimes some sort of physical activity, pulls us into a sense of power, and bogging around in your feelings can sometimes be bogging around in a sense of powerlessness. So thinking about what you can do together that's physical. But the other incredibly powerful thing is humor. So figuring out a way to share something that's funny, finding a way to find a joke on yourself, or I don't know. I think humor is vastly underrated as a tool for shifting things out of a sort of, I call it revving in the driveway. There's a lot of action and a lot of dust and no forward movement. If that's what you're struggling with your teen, I think it's probably useful to get some help thinking through that. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful. We should stop.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Madeleine, we learned so much. And again, Madeleine said you could contact her. You will be getting an email from Madeleine, with some resources and the connection to the recording of this. So thank you for joining us today, and keep an eye out for the parenting calendar for great upcoming workshops in the next few months on our website. Yep.
And thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you to Randwick City Council for helping to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Ciao.